BioCentury This Week is brought to you by Icon Biotech. As a world-leading healthcare intelligence and clinical research organization dedicated to the needs of small and mid-sized biopharma companies, Icon Biotech helps biotech organizations meet their critical milestones and deliver data and evidence-based results to investors, large pharma partners, and regulatory authorities. Icon Biotech advances clinical research by offering integrated outsourced services and solutions delivered by dedicated biotech teams and management that understand the different pressures faced by biotechs in their drive to solve today's challenges without losing sight of their mission to deliver life-changing innovations tomorrow.
It's JP Morgan Monday here in Biotech Land, and as usual, I am coming to you from the San Francisco Bay Area, where for the first time in recent memory during JP Morgan week, it is not raining, but it is raining deals. Ringing the bell with the biggest takeout is J&J, which is paying nearly $15 billion for Intracellular in what is the third really big neuro deal in the past 13 months. And in a win for Alexis Borisy, GSK is taking out IDRx, a 3-year-old private company co-founded by the veteran of EQRx and Third Rock. It has a clinical C-kit for gastrointestinal stromal tumors, and the price tag is $1 billion up front. We'll also discuss the Lillian Scorpion deal, and we'll head to the Hill for Steve's conversation with Representative Jake Auchincloss, and we'll talk up some highlights among last year's regulatory decisions by FDA, and we are getting reports of a Crowley sighting in Mar-a-Lago. We'll find out more on that on the latest BioCentury This Week podcast. I'm Jeff Cranmer, one of the executive editors here, and joining me today are my colleagues
Stephen Hansen, Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
Steve Uston, Washington Editor.
Lauren Martz, Executive Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
Okay, it's JP Morgan Monday, and deals have been flowing. Stephen, what's your take on the amount of deals we're seeing? Is it kind of like the good old days, or is this kind of a new normal? What's your take?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. You got me with that intro with the raining deals for sure. It kind of feels like
you haven't had to suffer through the flash flood warnings of the past few years in San Francisco.
No, you're right. But it kind of, I kind of feel like it's maybe feels like it was kind of pre-COVID, maybe, because I feel like when COVID happened, that kind of interrupted a lot of things. And then the last couple of years, we didn't have many deals that were being timed up with JPM. But now it feels like, as you say, it kind of feels like a throwback to the JP Morgan of old, where you would expect a big deal to be kind of held up and launched on the first day of the conference. So
tell me about this J&J deal.
Yeah. So, well, first off, I think a great outcome for Intracellular. It's a company that I know a lot of the specialists were big into for their growth opportunity there for their Caplyta, their schizophrenia drug. But, I think it seems like a good fit for J&J as well. They've obviously have a presence and they've been trying, I think, in neuropsych for a long time, right? I mean, they've got some old drugs that they still make up a decent amount of their commercial revenues. I think when we looked, it was about 12.5% is kind of what it makes up of the revenues now. But those have been around for a long time. But, I looked back at their 2013 revenues, and it was largely those same drugs like Invega and Risperidol, those sorts of things that were there. And at the time, they made up like 25% of their revenues. So neuroscience has long been an area that J&J has been in commercially. Unfortunately, it seems like, their pipeline programs haven't been able to continually come through to provide some new programs. And so I think this is them sort of maybe finally making the decision, okay, we need to buy some growth in this space rather than trying to bring it through internally. So I think it's good for them. It's going to be immediately accretive. I know a lot of analysts are pointing to, $5 billion plus opportunity here for this program. And, it's a good outcome for, as I said, a lot of specialist investors that were in this Avoro, ClearBridge, Perceptive, Deep Track Capital, I know all had pretty substantial holdings in Intercellular. So good for them. And also, just of note, this is the type of company that also has a pretty substantial generalist ownership stakes as well. So I think it's good for the sector as a whole that some of these generalist funds will get an M&A win from biotech, because it's been a while, I think, since they've made money in this sector. So good for them to see this sort of going forward, remind them that they can actually generate some returns from investing in biotech.
Yeah, and I always love seeing these like 20-plus-year-old companies get taken out. It's good to see. Founded in 2002, NASDAQ listed since 2014. Okay, Lauren, I wanted to bring you in now. I know that you are watching this Scorpion deal taken out by Lilly, and the total deal value, I believe, is $2.5 billion. We don't know what the upfront is. Then a spin-out's involved. Lauren, what are you seeing here?
Yeah, so Lilly is acquiring this company for the lead asset. It's a PI3 kinase alpha inhibitor, and it's not mutation selective, but it's wild type sparing. So last year we saw Eli Lilly drop a inhibitor of the same target that was specific for one mutation in the PI3KA in cancers. This is broader. It seems very similar to a preclinical asset that Eli Lilly already has. It also has, a more similar mechanism to what Relay Therapeutics has, and that's proven pretty interesting in clinical trials so far. The rest of the assets, are spinning out into a new company with Eli Lilly having a stake in that. And I think that's the latest in this sort of acquisition concurrent spin out model that we've seen more of recently.
Yeah, and what I think is interesting about this deal is, like, you look back, so Scorpion did a Series C, $150 million Series C last July. So a couple clinical assets, roster of a lot of crossover investors were in on that deal. So they look like they were maybe positioning themselves for an IPO. I think it'll be interesting now. They haven't disclosed kind of how much money is going into that new spin out company. So it'll be interesting to see how much goes in there and whether the new co is similarly positioned for a potential IPO, or whether they get enough sort of cash in that they can stay private and have no need to do that. So it'd be kind of interesting to see what happens with Scorpion 2.0, I guess.
Yeah, and this is really kind of continuing a trend we've been seeing for the past few years, right, Stephen? There was the Biohaven deal, and was it the Actelion deal that really kind of set the mold?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, and I sort of look at that one as being kind of the first sort of major deal that sort of had this sort of structure. And I think more and more people are kind of maybe looking at this as a good way to kind of compromise, right? Because, you could envision a scenario in which maybe Lilly wanted to buy all of Scorpion, but, the VC investors or the board didn't think that Lilly was putting, a high enough valuation on some of the earlier stage assets. Maybe they just wanted the lead asset. And so this can be maybe a nice way to sort of compromise, right? So Lilly gets what they wanted, which was primarily the lead asset. And then the investors, they make a guaranteed return, but then they also get some upside from the rest of the pipeline that maybe they have more conviction on in terms of the value that was there than the acquirer did. So it seems like a good deal structure to work it out if you can't reach terms on a full takeout.
All right. And in the sort of old school model, we have the GSK deal. The company is buying IDRX, and that's a Boston company that was launched in 2022. And the deal includes a highly selective TKI designed for GIST. Any thoughts on this, Lauren? Stephen?
Yeah, so this sort of gets GSK into the race. This is where Blueprint and Decifera were kind of the main actors in GIST, the gastrointestinal stromal tumors. I don't know a lot about this asset particularly. This one wasn't sort of on my radar, but I know this is the, I think, Alexis Borisy company. This is kind of his follow-on act after EQRX. So obviously a good win for him to see him back in there.
It makes sense, if you think about it, a TKI for just because Gleevec, which is a TKI, was repurposed for GIST, and it had, some efficacy there. So you can kind of see the provenance of the idea going all the way back to those days.
Yeah, This compound, GSK is saying something that caught their eye is it's shown activity against all the primary and secondary KIT mutations. So we'll see where they take this in the clinic. We've got a lot of other stuff to cover. I just want to give a shout out to a couple of the other deals of the day. We had Gilead tying up with Leo Pharma, and on the call this morning, I asked Stephen, isn't that one of those old school companies? And as it turns out, 1908, so a little bit older even than me. And wow, $250 million up front for a STAT6 small molecule and some targeted protein degraders. Total deal value $1.7 billion. Telix has been very active. They uplisted on the NASDAQ, Australian company here, and they've made another US purchase, gaining something out of a radiopharma, something targeting DLL3. And we've also got another deal in the radiopharma space, Lantheus and Life Molecular, and a few others that we'll be rounding up for you in today's deal report. But now I want to go to Washington. I'm trying to get Steve to kind of parse out his stories, but he's ringing me up on the weekend to get stuff out. There's a lot happening in DC. First, Steve, I want to ask you about a story you I think you broke last week on John Crowley heading down to the greater Palm Beach area in Florida. What did you learn?
So John Crowley, who of course is the president and CEO of the Biotechnology Industry Trade Association, he was slated to visit with Trump and his health team over the weekend to discuss the formation of an advisory group of some sort that's going to make recommendations for reforming FDA. It's in its early stages. The plan was to announce it after the HHS secretary and FDA commissioner nominees were confirmed, but word got out. It's consistent with the DOGE approach, I think. It's likely to be outside of government, somewhat informal, because I think they're not going to want to comply with all of the disclosure regulations that come with a formal government advisory group, certainly not with any of the divestiture requirements that would come with being government employees. I've talked to people about it over the weekend. I got calls from CEOs. I got calls from people at FDA. And there's really a striking kind of Manichean attitude toward FDA changes among all these people, among FDA officials, current and former, and among CEOs. They all say, on the one hand, big changes are needed. They're needed to keep up with the changes in technology. They're needed to make FDA fit for purpose for the 21st century. And they all also are worried. They say that if the changes aren't done well, the results could be disastrous. They could be disastrous for FDA. They could be disastrous for the companies that rely on FDA, and certainly for patients. It's continuing the same theme that I wrote about a few weeks ago, threat and opportunity, right?
Yeah, exactly, Steve. And Steve, this talk of FDA reform is coming at a time when we're seeing several top leaders move on from FDA. We've got Patrizia Cavazzoni announced that she was moving on last week. A few weeks ago, Bumpus said she was out the door. Temple, of course, is a little bit of a different case. He's been there for a very long time and has now retired. What kind of opening does this create, Steve?
Well, tremendous. Okay, so if you want to be able to change the FDA in dramatic ways, the only way you can do it is if you have your own team of people as center directors, because the center directors really run FDA, not the commissioner. Patrizia Cavazzoni, you mentioned, she's been the director of CDER, the Center for Drugs, for about 7 years. She wasn't exactly pushed out, but what I'm told is that she read the tea leaves. It was made clear that the new administration wants to have their own person running CDER. This creates a huge opportunity. As I said, center directors have a great deal of power at FDA, really more than the commissioner. If Marty Makary, Trump's commissioner nominee, who's very likely to be confirmed, wants to make disruptive change, which is what the Trump administration seems to be all about, he'll bring in somebody from the outside. The question is whether that person will be effective. It would really have to be someone with deep FDA experience or expertise to be effective, because it would take somebody else, somebody who doesn't really know the agency and doesn't have that knowledge of its culture, of the law, of the politics, internal and external. I think, a couple of years to be able to function effectively. On the other hand, I think it would be hard for McCary to make the case that he's a change agent if he promotes somebody from within. So again, this really highlights the uncertainty that hangs over FDA in the Trump administration. You mentioned Najami Bumpus. She was the principal deputy commissioner, really number two after Rob Califf. She's left. Also, Jeff Shuren, the head of the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, he's leaving. And that leaves the big question, right, about the other medical products center, the Center for Biologics, headed by Peter Marks. A lot of controversy there. People in the biopharma industry, by and large, really revere Peter Marks. So do people in the patient community. On the other hand, Marty McCary has been very critical of decisions that Marks has made regarding COVID-19. And there's a lot of Republican members of Congress who are also highly critical of Marks. It'll be really interesting, really important, I think, to see whether Marks stays in place. He's going to be under a lot of pressure. And we'll have to see what happens.
Okay, well, Marks and Cavazzoni joined us on our sister podcast in the not too distant past. That's the BioCentury Show. And, well, we had another very high profile guest on in an episode that we released yesterday. It's Representative Jake Auchincloss, a Democrat of Massachusetts. He is a very influential voice in Congress on life sciences issues. He's just gained in stature last week when he was appointed to serve on the Energy and Commerce Committee. Steve, what were some of your takeaways from the conversation with Representative Auchincloss?
So first off, he knows a lot about health policy. He knows a lot about the innovation ecosystem, and he's very articulate and smart. I think that's the overall impression anybody coming away from that interview would think. Specifics, we talked about PBM reform. He's introduced PBM reform legislation in the last Congress and intends to do so in this Congress. He expressed disappointment that another PBM reform bill, not one that went as far as his did, but still one that would make positive changes. He expressed disappointment that Speaker Johnson pulled it out of the must-pass spending bill at the last minute in December. And he also expressed confidence. He thinks that robust PBM reform could go through in the current Congress, that there's a lot of bipartisan support around that. We talked about the IRA. He expressed support, said there could be bipartisan support for changes to the IRA to address provisions in it that are disincentives for orphan drug development, but he doesn't think that there would be bipartisan support to go as far as the legislation that the biopharma industry has supported that was introduced in the last session that would create an unlimited exemption for drugs that have only orphan indications. He had an interesting idea. He said what he would support, what he thinks Democrats would support, would be an exemption that would time out as soon as the orphan indications for a drug exceeded 200,000 patients. It's an interesting idea. We talked about RFK Jr., and he shares my extraordinarily high level of concern.
He really didn't mince words on that one, Steve. He certainly is in agreement with some of what you wrote in one of your recent editor's commentaries. And
he said quack and conspiracist is what he said about him. and that's right. And
what was also really chilling for me, Steve, is when you both were talking about his trip to Samoa and the outcome of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's been covered in the press, but probably not enough. Basically, what happened is that RFK Jr. went to Samoa and he was very outspoken in his advocacy against vaccination. Vaccination rates went down. There was a measles outbreak. 83 people died, most of them children, and a lot more were sickened and hospitalized. There's a direct line that can be drawn between his activities there and those deaths. And as far as I'm concerned, and I think most public health experts are concerned, just that incident, leave aside all of the other things, concerns that people would have about RFK Jr., that should disqualify him from going anywhere near the levers of power in public health forever.
But he did seem to have a different take on some of incoming President Donald Trump's other healthcare picks.
Yeah, he basically was willing to give the benefit of the doubt to Marty McCary, again, who's the FDA commissioner pick, and to Jay Bhattacharya, who's the NIH director pick. Both of them are prominent, well-known scientists. He called them, safe hands, and said that he thinks that both of them are going to be making decisions that are based on scientific evidence. And I thought it was interesting. It's a kind of a nuance to his approach to it. He's not just saying, across the board that anybody that President Trump has picked for those positions would be a problem. Yeah, he said that he's got confidence in McCary and he's got confidence in Bhattacharya.
Excellent. Well, it's a terrific conversation. It is available on our YouTube channel, and you can also listen to it on Spotify and Apple, wherever you get your podcasts. Definitely check it out. This is a lawmaker to watch. He represents a district with a lot of biotech folks, suburbs of Boston, right down to the border of Rhode Island. All right, Steve, I know you've got to run, and we've got to talk about some of the regulatory decisions by FDA last year. Lauren, you did your annual deep dive. What do you want to highlight for us?
Thanks, Jeff. So I think 2024 was a continuation of a lot of the trends that we saw in 2023. So at CDER, there were a lot of approvals. It was 50. There have only been 4 years that had more than that. CBER was a different story. In 2023, there were 14. Last year, there were 9. So one of the questions that raises is, where are the new modalities? We heard a lot about how last year was supposed to be a breakout year for cell and gene therapies. There were some interesting approvals. Specifically, the ultra-rare gene therapy approval of Kebbilidi for AADC deficiency, I think was very important, and it could represent a turning point for cell and gene therapies because, again, this was an ultra-rare disease approved based on a new surrogate endpoint with limited clinical data. So that's something that we've been hearing about, the need to open up the accelerated approval pathway to gene therapies for ultra-rare diseases. So also on the new modalities front, there were no ADCs approved, no radioligand therapies approved. So those are just some of the big trends in clinical development that weren't represented in the approvals of last year. Some other notable trends were the fact that some big disease areas that we follow a lot, inflammation, didn't see a big breakout year, even though we've been seeing a ton of developments in the clinical landscape. Neurology similarly didn't have many approvals, but cancer continues to be the top indication.
Lauren, you mentioned a bit about cell and gene therapy. We did have a couple of firsts last year. Can you tell us about those?
Sure. So we had the first TIL, tumor infiltrating lymphocyte approval. So these are not modified with the CARs as the CAR T cells are from Iovance. There was also the first TCR T-cell therapy approved. And again, this is different than a CAR T because this uses an engineered version of the T-cell's natural T-cell receptor to target the pieces of intracellular targets in cancer cells that are presented on the cell surface. And then we also saw the first mesenchymal stem cell therapy from Mesoblast Limited.
Yeah, kudos to Mesoblast. I mean, stick-to-itiveness. That product was in phase 3 for about how long, Lauren? It was more than a decade.
Multiple decades, I think almost 20 years.
Yeah, I think you wrote two decades. So hats off to the Australian biotech for just keeping at it. And first in class, best in class, who won the day?
So it was pretty evenly split. Technically, there were more non-first in class approvals last year based on the definition that BioCentury uses throughout our coverage. The number of first in class approvals was pretty consistent. But something that we noted this year was that if you look through the not first in class approvals, there's almost always a compelling best in class potential story. These are very differentiated drugs that are reaching the market that can, have fewer side effects for patients or possibly be more effective than other options that are already there. And then also each year we look at different metrics for innovation. So obviously best in class is separate from that, but each of the past few years, the percentage of drugs against new targets, the percentage of drugs that are new modalities, and the number that are the first approvals for an indication have gone down. So that continued this year. But we looked at another metric, which was precision medicine approvals. And so by that, we mean drugs that are approved for a biomarker-defined subset of patients with the disease. And that has gone up significantly this year from last year and the year before. So I think that's a positive development and represents, a new form of innovation that we're beginning to see more of.
Excellent. Well, I always love this piece, Lauren. It wraps up the year in a couple thousand words. You can kind of step back and kind of drink it all in, and it helps you get ready for the year ahead. And speaking of the year ahead, we will continue to roll out our 2025 preview issues. We are looking to publish Lauren's Catalyst story, looking at the catalysts in the year ahead. It's a story that we've been writing since we were founded as BioCentury 30 years ago at H&Q. Now, JPM, of course, will have the 2025 public markets preview that Stephen is writing and several other stories. So look out for those on the way. The stories that we covered today on the pod, you can find at biocenturypodcast.com or click on the link in the show notes. I wish everyone a very successful JP Morgan week. If you are here, if you are one of the no JPM types and have opted for the ski slopes, I wish you much good powder and a very tasty après ski. All right, Lauren, Stephen, thanks for joining today, and thanks to Cole Travis, our production guru extraordinaire. And as always, a thank you to Kendall Square Orchestra, which provides the music for BioCentury this week. We will catch you later this week with a special edition of the podcast, wrapping up our JP Morgan takeaways, and then we'll be back with our regular podcast next Tuesday after the MLK Jr. holiday here in the U.S.
BioCentury would like to thank Icon Biotech for supporting the BioCentury This Week podcast. To learn more about how Icon Biotech can help you meet your critical milestones, go to iconplc.com/biotech.